Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Ashlee Lillis, a soundscape and invertebrate ecologist. Welcome to my seminar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'd like to thank the organizers from FishSounds for inviting me and including invertebrate sounds in the FishSounds Educate Seminar. I'm sorry that I couldn't do this live, but please feel free to reach out to me at this email address listed on the slide if you want to engage further on any of the topics that I mentioned today. So, snapping shrimp produce one of the loudest and most widespread of all biological sounds. The pervasive crackling that you're hearing here dominates shallow water habitats worldwide, and was probably the most fascinating mystery that I encountered when I began recording underwater sound about 15 years ago. Later in today's talk, I'll tell you more about these very fascinating creatures and talk about some of my research on them. But I'm also going to give a broad overview and general introduction to the subject of aquatic invertebrate sounds and why we might want to study them. So today I'm going to begin by talking about why myself and others study invertebrate sounds, explaining a bit of the importance of sound to invertebrate life histories and aquatic ecosystems. And then I'll give an overview of sound production with a range of examples before delving into the most prolific invertebrate sound producer and my study subject, the snapping or pistol shrimp. So I didn't actually start my career as a soundscape ecologist or bioacoustician at all, but rather more broadly as a marine benthic ecologist interested in studying seafloor communities, ecological processes, and biodiversity. And so I think the story of how I got interested in soundscapes and in particular invertebrate sounds is a good example of why someone might want to study invertebrate sounds. Just to note that I am a marine scientist, so a lot of what I refer to is marine invertebrate sounds today, but a lot of the concepts, of course, apply to aquatic invertebrates in general. So I don't want to exclude freshwater systems, and I'll give a couple of examples later in the talk. So as a marine benthic ecologist, I'm interested in all of the ecological processes that drive marine benthic communities. So when I think about marine communities such as reefs or rocky bottoms or seagrass, there's a whole suite of different ecological processes that contribute to the dynamics as well as environmental factors interacting with these processes. And in particular, my research interests center on the larval dispersal and settlement of marine invertebrates, especially habitat building marine invertebrates. And I'm interested in the behavioral cues and settlement cues for those organisms. So when I began studying this topic, the soundscape was emerging as a key cue for larval fish to home in on adult habitat. And there was a suggestion and a little bit of evidence that acoustic cues might also influence invertebrate larvae. And so I started using hydrophone and recording reef habitats. And by starting to record and characterize the acoustic environment or soundscape of benthic habitats, I realized that all of these processes that we're interested in better understanding marine benthic communities or marine ecosystems in general are embedded in a sound environment, in an acoustic environment. And if we think about it, it makes great sense that even the smallest creatures are using sound as part of their sensory adaptations, especially underwater. Sound is a terrific signal compared to many others. Sound is light and current independent. It's widely available, no matter what the depth, and is very information rich. It can tell an organism a lot about the environment. So I realized that if we want to start better understand what is driving these communities, these systems, or to understand the experience of a creature who lives there, we must consider the soundscape. So let's back up for a second so I can explain what I mean by soundscape, as it includes more than just the biological sounds, which I'm going to focus on today. Indeed, major contributors to a soundscape are physical and geological sounds, as well as those produced by humans. So sounds that are produced by sea creatures may be used in communication or produced as a byproduct of activities like feeding. And so my point here is the soundscape is a multifaceted and diverse acoustic environment composition, acoustic composition. And indeed, invertebrates both contribute to and are influenced by this acoustic environment. And so while traditional marine bioacoustics was marine mammal focused, and passive acoustic monitoring traditionally was dominated by military or industrial applications, as technology has become more available and more scientists have listened in from broad disciplines, there has been a burgeoning field of passive acoustic monitoring that includes monitoring biodiversity in general through acoustics, and also the importance of sound to invertebrates and even other organisms such as bacteria and plants is becoming more and more recognized and studied. And so I'd say the more we start listening to the sea or to other aquatic environments, we recognize that the creatures that live there have all evolved to take advantage of this very useful medium for communication, or just even if they don't produce sound, that they might be receptive to sound and using it as part of their life history. So while it's still little studied compared to cetaceans, examples have really been found across a range of invertebrate taxa, both to produce sounds and to contribute to soundscapes. And moreover, invertebrates are being revealed to respond to sound and to be affected by noise as well, whether or not they produce sound themselves, and across multiple life stages, sizes, habitat types, both mobile and sessile organisms. And of course, invertebrates make up the majority, at least 90-something% of all biodiversity in the sea. And most of them have not been examined for their sound production or characterized in that way. I'm going to give some examples of sounds that have been characterized, and we know of examples from at least 4 of the major invertebrate phyla, including annelids, echinoderms, mollusks, and crustaceans. But what I want to just point out is how little known this really is in the scope of all of the invertebrates that exist, because we really only have studied a handful of examples. So that sets the stage to talk about what we do know with respect to the sounds of aquatic invertebrates. And I'm really just giving an introduction to the diversity of sounds that have been characterized for invertebrates, to give you a sense of how diverse they are and how many more there are yet to be discovered or characterized and better understood. Okay, so here are some examples of the range of taxa that are producing sounds, and I want to play you some of these sounds just as a teaser before I talk a little bit more about how they're produced and what their ecological functions might be. So here's a spiny lobster called a rasp, scallops, okay, the stomatopod or mantis shrimp, quite an eerie sound there, sea urchin, one of my favorites, though this recording isn't great, sponge worm. That click you hear is the actual organism, not the background noise, but I'll show a video of this in a minute. And then, of course, the beloved snapping shrimp. The crackling sound is those guys. So I'll talk about two kinds of sounds, passive sounds and active sounds. So sounds may be produced by invertebrates indirectly as a result of animal activity. So that would be movement or feeding that produces sounds, and not necessarily intentionally. And then invertebrates are known to also intentionally produce sounds for communication, whether it be defensive, signaling, mating behavior, or interspecific communication. And so those we would call active sounds. And I'll give a couple examples, or go into a couple of the examples that I just played for you that would be each type. So about over 15 years ago, Craig Radford and colleagues found that when there were big groups of sea urchins, they could be detectable in the soundscape. And so this was caused by the sea urchins' Aristotle lantern, their feeding parts scraping against rocks and all together creating what they called a coastal chorus. And so you can see here in this figure that they were able to characterize the actual sound itself and the frequency band, and then use this when they're recording to detect the activity of these urchins. And since then, other researchers have also done this in other places. And so sea urchins are a great example of echinoderms that are producing sound, not intentionally, but as part of their feeding behavior. And this can be used in passive acoustic monitoring, or is detectable presumably by other creatures in the environment as well as part of their soundscape. Similarly, Lucia Diorio was able to monitor scallops and scallop movements using underwater recordings. Scallops swim through propulsion of their two shells and make that sound that I played for you earlier. That's kind of a whoosh. And so through passive acoustics and tank experiments, they were able to record and identify how many scallops there were in an area. You can see here with the schematic that they were doing this in a large tank and able to really characterize these movement patterns and activity of this invertebrate through its sound. So I think that's a very cool example of using sound to better understand the ecology and presence of invertebrates in the environment. And the last passive sound made by invertebrates that I wanted to highlight is a very interesting recent example from planktonic soundscapes. And so even in the plankton, there are invertebrates that are contributing to the soundscape. And in this case, this is zooplankton copepods that were found by researchers to produce sounds that were detectable with their hydrophones, but also within the hearing range of predators. So this is a good example of how sounds might be produced as a byproduct of swimming or feeding by invertebrates, and then of course utilized by both us who might want to detect those creatures, but also other creatures that want to detect their prey. And so you can check out this paper if you want to know more about the copepod sounds and how they are influencing the soundscape. And so before I get into crustacean sounds, which are the most well-studied out of the invertebrate sounds, I wanted to first give an example of an active sound, a seemingly, intentionally produced sound made by an invertebrate as a behavioral cue or for a behavioral purpose that is not a crustacean. And this is a very, very cool finding from a few years ago of a relatively deep sea, I think lives at 80 to 100 meters in sponges, this worm that does what they call mouth fighting and produces a remarkably loud snap comparable to a snapping shrimp. So very detectable, very loud, and produced in their, I guess, pharynx is, if annelids have such a thing. So let's watch a video here of this behavior, and hopefully you can hear the sound. Okay, so check out that paper if you want to watch the full video. I think you get the idea. And one interesting thing to point out here is that as far as I know, this hasn't been investigated any further. It's very fascinating example of benthic invertebrates, cryptic invertebrates that live inside of something else that are clearly producing these sounds, but we don't really understand how or why. And this is contributing to the acoustic environment that we are recording if we're doing soundscape ecology. And so no doubt there are many other creatures that might be producing sounds that we're either attributing to something else or just not understanding at all. As I mentioned, crustaceans are the most well-known sound-producing aquatic invertebrates and known for producing sounds intentionally as part of their behavioral repertoire. This doesn't mean that they are extremely well understood, just that compared to other invertebrates, they're better studied. And examples of sound producers include hermit crabs, lobsters, shrimp, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. And I just wanted to show a couple examples of papers that are quite interesting. Spiny lobsters have been studied by a couple of groups looking into the function of the spiny lobster sounds as a defensive sound, as well as used within species communication. And another recent paper found that spiny lobster sounds can be detectable quite far away. So this could be relevant both for humans, scientists who are using passive acoustic monitoring that might want to monitor spiny lobsters, as well as their predators who might be able to detect them in the soundscape. I should also point out that freshwater crayfish are among the most well-studied and characterized for their acoustic signals as well. Stomatopods, also known as mantis shrimp, have been known to produce sounds as early as the 1980s through stridulation, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And that low frequency rumble that I played earlier is produced by the stomatopods through muscle contraction in their abdomen and seems to be used in defense and in interspecies communication. So a recent review by Craig Radford and Jenny Stanley on sound detection and production mechanisms is a really good overview for anyone who wants to learn more about how crustaceans are producing and also receiving sound. There's three main production mechanisms that are described in this paper, including stridulation, so that basically rubbing body parts against each other, which luckily decapod crustaceans have a lot of legs and antennules to rub against each other and create these rasping sounds. Of course, cavitation is a very unique and special sound production mechanism by snapping shrimp, and I'm going to get into that next. And as I just mentioned, muscle contraction is displayed by stomatopod crustaceans as well. And you can see that they produce sounds in different frequency bands that have been characterized here and can be unique sound signatures for these different type of organisms that could be detected and identified in soundscape recordings. So I just wanted to end this section to say that this is a very quick overview of what we know about sound production by crustaceans, but also by invertebrates in general. But even the crustaceans that we know better than the rest of the diversity of invertebrates are relatively poorly known. And so this is me encouraging others to investigate them further and know that there is so much to be explored and discovered about invertebrate sounds, the acoustic ecology of invertebrates, and the majority of the biodiversity in aquatic environments. Okay, so for basically the second half of this talk, I want to delve into the most prolific and ubiquitous sound-producing marine invertebrate, the snapping shrimp, and tell you more about them, their biology, acoustic ecology, and the research that I have been and continue to do to better understand their soundscape influence. If you put your head underwater almost anywhere in the world outside of the coldest places, you will probably hear some version of this sound, crackling, static, and most people don't even think about what it might be, or they've had some idea that it's just the rocks or their ears. But in fact, it's a very special type of shrimp called the snapping shrimp, or in some places, the pistol shrimp. And I'm going to talk a lot about that for the rest of this seminar, and the diversity of these creatures and all sorts of other interesting things about them and work that we are doing to learn more. This map I put together shows the global extent of where snapping shrimps have been found. And you can see it encompasses pretty much all of the temperate and tropical nearshore environments in the world. I want to share a bit about the history of the discovery of snapping shrimp sound and the history of the science behind that, as I find it quite fun and interesting, and really emblematic of the fact that we might hear a lot of creatures if we start listening, but we won't necessarily see them. So snapping shrimp are a great example of this, where people who went to sea or slept within the holds of ships could hear this crackling sound. As I said, if you're in the nearshore environment and you put your head underwater, you almost always can hear this type of crackling or static sound. But for a really long time, no one knew what was causing this sound. And so you can see through the literature for hundreds of years, there were descriptions of the sound that later became known to be produced by colonies of these tiny shrimp. And you would see it described as the sizzle of frying fat, a strange crackling sound, troublesome noise, and some other very colorful descriptions that maybe don't age well, like dragging a blackberry vine and coal rolling down a metal chute. And so in this historical documentation, we also see that people came up with explanations for what the sound must be, and that included things that also don't really make too much sense, like rolling pebbles and surf, ship hull fouling, the clapping of oyster and clam shells, which now we do know scallops do make a sound, but certainly not a constant sizzling or static sound. And so it wasn't until this suspicious wartime activity became an important threat during World War II that scientists were tasked with investigating further what this strange crackling sound actually was. And so the University of California's Division of War Research investigated and confirmed that what submarines and military vessels were picking up on their listening devices was in fact the product of large beds of snapping shrimp and colonies of snapping shrimp. And so this isn't to say that prior to this, it wasn't known that snapping shrimp exist or can produce a sound. Certainly there was crustacean biologists, and there's examples in the literature before that of the description of the shrimp themselves by crustacean biologists, that the shrimp could produce the sound like a cork being popped, for example. But until this time, there wasn't any description in the literature of this contribution to the soundscape, and that this constant pervasive crackling sound that can be detected in bays and harbors and all of these nearshore environments was actually a biological phenomenon. So it was quite interesting report that the University of California Division of War Research put out on the underwater noise caused by snapping shrimp. Some very beautiful 1940s graphic design. And one of the main outputs and results that they described was the calculation of how fast their vessel could go and still be masked sonically by the snapping shrimp. So basically, the military of the US was attempting to use this biological sound as like a cloaking sheath to make it so that their enemies could not detect them underwater. And so this is just part of what I think is snapping shrimp's fascinating history with human interaction that continues to today. Okay, so a bit about the snapping itself. As you heard in the recordings, and as I've told you, the thousands of snapping shrimp that may live in a reef or in a rocky bottom are together producing that crackling sound. But how loud is a shrimp snap compared to other sound sources? It's actually extremely loud. It's one of the loudest individual signals produced biologically in the sea. It competes with sperm whale clicks for being the loudest. The snapping shrimp, of course, are very tiny, and they are producing the sound in like a tenth of a millisecond, but it is incredibly powerful and can reach up to 200 some decibels in intensity. How exactly do they produce that sound? Well, as I said, people who studied shrimp or were looking at these creatures even in the 1800s recognized that they had this huge oversized claw and that it was used during defense or interactions and produced a loud sound. Now, they could not quite figure out how such a tiny creature, often this example is quite large, but often they're only millimeters to a couple centimeters. I think the largest one is maybe 8 or 9 centimeters long, but the claw is a huge part of that length and quite a formidable morphological adaptation. And so it wasn't actually until the late 1900s when high-speed videography came around that researchers were able to identify the actual mechanism of snapping and how such a tiny, tiny shrimp could produce such a loud sound. Because before, it just wasn't mechanically possible or understandable how, if this was being made more through stridulation or just the closure of the claw and the two parts of the claw hitting each other, how that could actually produce a 200 decibel sound. And so they produced this wonderful video that you can find on YouTube if you look for it, and then you can hear their explanation, which as physicists is probably a little better than mine. But what they found by tickling shrimp and slowing down the video was that, in fact, the sound was produced by a cavitation bubble. So the force by which the claw is closed is so powerful that basically the pressure change causes a bubble to pop, to form and to pop, and this is what produces the sound. So even the tiniest snapping shrimp can produce a loud sound, and together then in their colonies can really create the background noise of many coastal seas. And so I encourage you to learn more about that. So something interesting that has stemmed from this literature is a lot of biomechanics research and even biomimicry in material science to emulate this claw. And I've seen papers come out on 3D printing of shrimp claws and practical applications for humans of this. So that's a bit about the history and the mechanism of sound production. But what about the ecology of this, or how does this relate to soundscape ecology? Well, ever since passive acoustic monitoring has become more interesting as a biodiversity monitoring tool, snap metrics or snapping derived acoustic metrics have been suggested and implied that they could be used as an indicator of habitat health, recovery, biodiversity, especially because they are really the backbone of the benthic soundscape. So whether it be coral reefs or oyster beds or rocky environments, often the snapping shrimp and this background sound. And so we wanted to know, how can we actually use this? However, I like to say it's not that simple. Unfortunately, we don't really understand yet what the snapping means. So it's very hard to connect the snapping shrimp patterns to a metric of habitat health or ecological change. So early work did suggest that snapping shrimp sounds were consistent and predictable, following a stereotypical diel variation, so dawn and dusk peaks, and that this could be potentially a good indicator of certain type of habitat. So at least like presence of snapping shrimp sound would reliably indicate what type of environment you were recording in, and something about it. But this was from the 1940s, and when technology increased and we were able to record in more places and for longer than just a day at a time, and also to detect the snaps and analyze them in different ways, we've actually found that there's very complex variation at multiple scales. So these figures are showing some work that I've done over the last 10 years, recording soundscapes in tropical environments. This is on coral reef, but this goes for other places as well, in more subtropical or temperate habitats. What I've actually found when we measure the soundscape and then actually count the snaps, or have our computer count the snaps, because sometimes it can be like 7,000 per minute in the environment, we actually find that nearby reefs have extremely different patterns, not only in the overall rates of snapping, but also the patterns throughout the day. So we actually have found places where there's more daytime snapping than nighttime snapping, and seen that shift seasonally. Or we find places that consistently have dawn and dusk peaks, but then completely change after a hurricane or other type of ephemeral event. So this is all to say that it's not very easy to interpret, but I think this gives even more of an opportunity to better understand what's driving these patterns and use this as a tool to understand the habitats in which they live. Clearly, the snapping shrimp sounds can tell us a lot about what's going on if we understood them better. Another example is in South African kelp forests, where snapping shrimp are also abundant. We've found places where we have lots and lots of snapping shrimp sound, and then just a few hundred meters away, there's no snapping shrimp. But as far as we can visually tell, it's a very similar type of habitat, same type of kelp forest, and yet the acoustic ecology of the snapping shrimp is very different. So we're finding a lot of variation on multiple scales across the world, and it really points to the fact that the acoustic ecology, the underlying fundamental behaviors and interactions and basic ecology for snapping shrimp really isn't well known. And so if we want to use their sound as some sort of metric, or even if we don't and we just are studying soundscapes, unfortunately the snapping shrimp sound is there whether you like it or not, and it would be good if we knew more about these. But maybe this variation that we're discovering actually is not too surprising when we consider that there's actually over 600 known species of the families that are snapping shrimp. And this is considered hyper diverse, that the most diverse families of shrimp in the sea. And that with that comes a tremendous diversity of habitat, life histories, and their symbiotic relationships. Very fascinating examples. But really, their basic ecology and acoustic ecology especially is not studied. Almost all of the papers about snapping shrimp have come from a handful of species, maybe 3 or 4, most just a single species. And this means that when we look at our soundscape patterns and the snapping, what we're really examining is a whole composite of hundreds of different species with potentially different acoustic patterns. So there is a lot to work out to be able to interpret this dominant part of marine soundscapes. But it also, as I said before, gives an opportunity if we can figure out what all the snapping is about for certain species. Maybe there are some that are indicators of certain types of habitat and certain patterns that emerge could be very, very useful for biodiversity monitoring and just understanding these ecosystems. So this is where I started going down what I call the shrimp hole. As a postdoc about 10 years ago, I had been listening to soundscapes, as I told you at the start of this talk, more from the perspective of larval ecology, and I had constantly been fascinated by these shrimp and them making all of this sound and nobody understanding it. And so I decided to do some lab investigations of drivers of snapping patterns. Of course, I myself could only work on a couple species that were the dominant ones in the southeastern United States. And could only realistically uncover a few things about them in a couple years. But I'll tell you a little bit about that now. So I brought them into the lab and did experiments, mostly looking at some of the environmental drivers and social groupings on their behavior. And I really wanted to link it to those observations I was making in the field, my soundscape recordings that I couldn't quite understand why there was differences between seasons, what these shrimp might be up to in their lives. And so here you see some shrimp. These are relatively large ones, and they are fighting or interacting and using their snap claw. And you can easily hear the snaps. When you have them in the lab, you can hear them across the whole room snapping. So yeah, it's not a subtle sound and very easy to measure indeed. And so I won't go into details. You can find papers on this work, Googling my name and snapping shrimp, I'm sure. But I established, at least for the species of shrimp that I looked at, which was 2, that the snap rates were influenced by temperature, time of day, and social context. And so we're able to relate that to some of the field data and at least have a little bit more interpretation of it in that particular habitat. And we did indeed always see that the sound pressure levels in our subtropical habitat were driven by the snapping patterns and closely related to temperature. And so the main factor that seemed to be influencing the overall amount of snapping by this crustacean was temperature, but also there's more subtle variation happening depending on seasons that is behaviorally mediated. But overall, there's a lot of implications for the soundscape and the noise floor that is related to snapping shrimp. So I'm always telling other soundscape ecologists or preaching to them the importance of paying attention to the shrimp. It's important to the animals that live in these environments. They are known to detect and respond, or at least have their own signals masked by snapping shrimp. But of course, again, looking at this slide, which is just a few of the hundreds of shrimp and the diversity of shrimp around the world, there's a lot to uncover about the other species. I want to mention here that many of these shrimp are living in colonies that are very complex in their social communities, and this likely contributes to all of the variation that we find in snapping shrimp. So there's really something for everyone to study. My current mission in my explorations of snapping variation around the world is to basically describe that variation. I've been making recordings of soundscapes or have projects in several ocean basins. Currently, I'm based in East Africa and focusing on snapping patterns and shrimp here, and really just trying to show how much diversity there is. Now, before I wrap up, I just want to highlight an example of a study that's ongoing in collaboration with Sophie Nedelec at the University of Exeter and the Australian Institute of Marine Science and Miles Parsons there. We are co-supervising a PhD student, Hannah Gower, and she is looking at snapping shrimp and snapping patterns and really trying to disentangle how we can use the pervasive snapping shrimp sounds with all of this variation and interpret it in a way that's ecologically relevant and applicable to conservation or biodiversity monitoring. And so you can see her here with her head in a tank, listening to sounds of shrimp, or listening to see if there's sounds of shrimp. And these are pictures of a lot of the shrimp that we were collecting there late last year. And so stay tuned, because that's going to produce, I think, some very interesting results and really get at this small scale individual organism up to large scale passive acoustic monitoring. And that is really fundamental to these goals of soundscape ecology. I want to round out the talk by kind of going from that, these tiny shrimp, to the big picture, and again, why I think the story of the snapping shrimp is so cool in terms of, studying this tiny animal and what it's doing in its life, but it actually has a huge impact on the soundscape and also marine ecology and the science of it all. And so whether or not, if you're like me, you think it's interesting or cool to study these organisms just for the sake of studying the organism, but a lot of people want to know, like, so why do we care? What does it matter, right? And so as this field of soundscape ecology and ecoacoustics and the holistic looking at the ability to monitor ecosystems through their soundscape patterns, the dream is to be able to make these acoustic recordings and then interpret from the patterns things like reef quality and function, or habitat quality and function, fish and invertebrate diversity, animal behavior and ecology. So if you're interested in those scallops or those crabs or that lobster, you might be able to derive that from the soundscape, as well as human impacts and what is there, right? But what we see with the story of the snapping shrimp as well is that we really need better characterization and understanding of not only the sounds themselves, this is the case with both fish and invertebrates, is that the actual sounds need to be characterized and put in these databases like FishSounds and then applied to soundscape recordings, but better basic ecology as well, right? So I really think that in ecoacoustics, there's something for everyone. So those of us who like to do the fundamental research on animal behavior and the specific sound production mechanisms or the biomechanics or whatever, and it can go from small scale to broad scale. And those who are looking at this from a more applied conservation bent, that's all combined. We need it all. And I would say that we're still at a fundamental research stage, or where fundamental research is really critical to this field. So we, really want to have this dream achieved where we can have conservation organizations or governments or, end users be able to put out sound recorders in the field and then interpret ecologically what's going on, environmental change, all of these things. But when we consider the fact that 90+% of all of the sounds that we're actually recording, we can't identify or we don't know what they mean, I would argue that a better understanding of the acoustic ecology of marine animals, especially marine invertebrates, is critical to this field to really reach that potential. And I also want to end this talk by saying that it wasn't long enough for me to go in depth on many, many interesting related topics that involve aquatic invertebrates, such as sound reception by invertebrates, the other sound-mediated ecological processes that are really fascinating for things like larvae that I study, the community level effects of sounds and how researchers are trying to understand how sounds fit into more population or community ecology, and of course the impacts of anthropogenic noise. And so those are all active topics, and I really encourage anyone who's interested in that and aquatic invertebrates to dig deeper into the emerging literature, and also to contact me with any questions that arise from this presentation. I apologize to the freshwater folks or people who study invertebrates in other contexts. I know this was very marine focused, but I look forward to learning more about freshwater invertebrate sounds too. I know that they have insects, water insects that are making sounds, and lots of other cool examples as well. So with that, I will thank a ton of collaborators that contribute to my snapping shrimp research over the last 12 or so years. Yeah, a lot of people who help with all of this work. So I will end with a quote from Whitlow Owl, who was a godfather of marine mammal bioacoustics, but I love this quote from his paper that was focused on dolphins, of course, but he said dolphins often swim through an area and then leave, whereas snapping shrimps are forever. So highlighting the importance of better understanding these snapping shrimp that are forever. So thank you so much for your attention.